Students go about their business one quiet evening at Barnet College. The day has been mostly uneventful, until the peace is suddenly disturbed by gunfire coming from the archaeology department's storage room, followed by a car racing through the campus grounds with an all-out brawl going on in the back seat. Some shocked bystanders are close enough to see that one of the men involved in this brawl is one of their professors, not realizing that this is just another day in the office when it comes to Dr. Jones. Welcome to the Indiana Jones Lorecast, where we delve into the lore and the history of the Indiana Jones series. Hello everyone, and welcome to the show. This will be the first tale that we are pulling from the archives. Today we will be covering Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis. This is one of the comics published by Dark Horse. It is a rather lengthy one and is a fantastic story with a lot of good stuff in it, so without any further delay, let's just hop right in. The story begins with a dream sequence. It is a rather strange and very short scene. Indy stands before a large figure who calls himself Tenochtitlan, the god of war, and the scenery around them seems to be a temple chamber of some sort with an Aztec-esque style to it. An order is given to throw Indy into a pit of crocodiles, and while trying to escape this fate, he is berated by spears, arrows, and then arrowheads flying at him. At this, he jolts awake in bed. We see that he is in the faculty quarters at Barnet College, the school where he teaches. He remarks to himself that the dream that he just had was the result of him dwelling on tomorrow's lecture. Has to be. He falls back asleep without further incident. The date is May 6, 1939. Classes are in session, and a tall stranger makes his way across the campus. We then see Indy in the classroom, giving the lecture on arrowheads previously mentioned. He tells his class that he'd like them to get some experience in age grading real Indian arrowheads, basically telling how old they are. At this, a student in the back, a jock-type look about him, is talking to a girl beside him, and he is saying how easy age-grading arrowheads is. This doesn't go unnoticed, as Indy calls him up to the front of the class to go first. He does so quite confidently. Indy tells him to arrange a set of arrowheads in order of oldest to newest. He does this, too, again, quite confidently, going on about how, well, this is easy because you just have to look at how rough they are. The crudest are clearly the oldest because the Indians didn't have much to start with, and then they got better tools as they went on, and, that sort of thing. Looking at how the student, whose name is Jerry, had arranged the arrowheads, Indy tells him that it's an interesting theory, except this ancient arrowhead that he's picked out was made in Japan in 1911. And this other one, which he has arranged as being an old one, well, he made that one himself this morning. The class erupts in laughter at this. At this point, a voice comes from the back of the class. It is an older-looking man with a moustache, tall and thin. This man then goes on to correctly age-grade the arrowheads from across the classroom. Indy is, of course, impressed by this. The man introduces himself as Samuel Korn, and Indy asks if he's an archaeologist too. Mr. Korn responds by saying that he has played many roles, and that today's role is that of the searcher. He wants Indy's help in identifying the designs on a strange-looking key sort of object, which he assures him is very ancient indeed. Later in the cafeteria, Indy is examining this strange little artifact and asks Mr. Korn if he may keep it overnight to study it further. He agrees and says that he'll be back for it. Sitting beside Indy is Dr. Marcus Brody, fellow archaeologist, historian, and museum curator, as well as a lifelong friend of Indy's. A really fantastic character. They sit, discussing what this object could be. Across the cafeteria, Jerry, the student from earlier, sees them and calls out, "Dr. Jones!" But Indy is too deep in thought to answer or even notice him. Jerry then comes walking up behind Indy to talk to him and accidentally bumps into him, spilling orange juice all over him. He apologizes and Indy asks him what the problem is. He goes on to explain that his grades aren't doing so well and that he just sucks at all the, as he calls it, old stuff, and that they're going to drop him from the football team if he flunks the course. Indy is not really listening because his eyes are drawn to the cafeteria's table in front of him, where the orange juice has now formed a sort of swirling pattern in front of him, and upon seeing this, he is suddenly struck by a memory. He jumps up from the table suddenly, spilling orange juice all over Marcus Brody in the process. Poor Marcus. Indy finally remembers the Jastro expedition. The key that he's holding shares a design motif with artifacts that were found on the Jastro expedition in Iceland, which was in fact Indy's first dig. They brought back a load of these artifacts, which all show similar craftsmanship to this key. He and Marcus then take off from the cafeteria. Indy tells Jerry to come see him after class on Friday. Just sort of, just like, this is more important, just come see me then. So later on, night falls, as the two men look through the college's archaeology department storage room, an enormous room filled with large dusty shelves which have artifacts of every shape and size. They are discussing the artifacts from the Jastro expedition, and that they were dated to be around 3,000 years old. But as they spend time searching the room, from outside the window, from under a tree, they are being watched. They eventually find one of the artifacts from the expedition, a strange-looking horned idol with its arms stretched above its head like goalposts, no larger than a desk lamp. There is a hole in this idol, and the key that they now have is able to unlock it. Inside the idol they find a strange purple orb of some kind. It looks like a pearl. It's about the size of a large marble. And while they are looking at this thing, in the doorway there now stands a man in a coat. It's Mr. Korn, and he has a gun. Holding out one of his hands, he demands that they hand over the artifact. As the both of them raise their hands above their heads, Indy quietly says to Marcus, "This is just like that time in Algiers, right, Marcus?" And Marcus responds, "Algiers? Oh, yes, indeed." And suddenly both of them, upon shouting, "Now!" they both dive out of the way as the gun fires, and they're able to evade the gunfire by hiding behind shelves and furniture, and Mr. Korn then begins to flee. Indy chases him down the hallway, shouting back to Marcus to call the cops. He tackles Mr. Korn, but he gets away, and is able to make it to a waiting car outside. It has an open top with no roof. Shouting to the driver, "Schnell, schnell," as he climbs in. Interesting. As the car screeches off, Indy jumps onto the car and is tackling Mr. Korn in the back seat. During the struggle, Mr. Korn is able to place the barrel of his gun right against Indy's forehead, quite villainously declaring, "Goodbye, Dr. Jones." Something to that effect. And at this moment, in a very close call, he is tackled by a second person. It is Jerry, again, who then joins the scuffle on the moving car. Something interesting to note here is that during the fight, Mr. Korn is also exclaiming and cursing in German. Interesting. Students and faculty alike stare in shock at the car that is speeding through the campus with a three-man brawl atop it. The brawl comes to an end when both Indy and Jerry tumble off of the car, taking Mr. Korn's coat with them as it rips from him. The car races off, leaving the two of them in a heap on the road. Jerry, in between pants and huffs, says that he had been following Indy to ask about his grades again, and Indy responds by saying to him, "Well, good news, you just passed." So, easy solution for him, I suppose, if you want to call that easy. As everyone gathers themselves, they search the coat and find that Mr. Korn's ID is inside, and it is a German ID book. The man's real name is Klaus Körner, and he is a colonel in the SS. Well, so they all sit discussing what a Nazi officer would be doing here and what he wants. Jerry then shows them a newspaper that he had found in the coat pocket, one that has an article on the front circled. The article is about a woman named Sophia Hapgood. It speaks about her life, saying how she has moved on from a career in archaeology in order to become a fortune teller and a mystic, who gives readings to her clients from her home in New York City. Indy remarks how she worked alongside him on the Jastro expedition. This explains Körner's interest in finding her. Indy has to get to New York City, and fast. In a penthouse apartment in the heart of New York City, a gathering is taking place. Sophia Hapgood, a woman with long reddish-brown hair, has a group of her esteemed clientele in her apartment captivated as she tells them a story, the story of the lost continent of Atlantis. She explains that it was the most advanced civilization in the history of mankind, and that they had technology far beyond ours. She points out all of these strange artifacts littered around the apartment as artifacts from the ancient and lost continent. These artifacts are in fact of the same design motif as the collection at Barnet College, the ones we have already seen. Her necklace that she wears, she claims, is the source of her mystic power, as it allows her to communicate with a great spirit god who she calls Nur Absal. At this point, Indy shows up at the front door, now wearing his fedora, an iconic part of his outfit. He has a mocking grin on his face as he begins to openly insinuate that this whole thing is a scam. When asked by the clientele who he is, he says that he is Dr. Jones from the New York Commission on Fraud and Confidence Games, and that he would like testimonies from all of them. They all suddenly have excuses, such as full calendars and, "Oh, I am late for an interview," and they all awkwardly exit the room. Indy and Sophia are left in her now empty apartment. Sophia smiles at him and greets him, "Indiana Jones," and he begins to reply with, "Oh, good to see you," when she smashes a vase over his head and then punches him in the face, shouting, "You smug, self-righteous son of a gun!" His first response to this is to say, "Good grief, please don't tell me that vase was a valuable piece." And she angrily responds to that by saying that it wasn't, and that she wouldn't waste one on him. They then have an argument about her career, with Indy telling her that she was really good in the archaeology field, and asking why she threw it all away to scam wealthy people all day, essentially. She tells him that she grew tired of being constantly shut down and having to watch her male peers climb the academic ladder. Once things cool down, the two of them talk about the expedition in Iceland and the artifacts that they found there, with Indy explaining that he was almost killed over it. He asks her if he can stay the night on the couch to examine the artifacts there and try to find out what makes them so valuable. After Sophia heads to bed, Indy gets to work. Two things to note here before we continue. He did not have romantic feelings for Sophia ever. He sits while studying the artifacts and reminisces that despite them spending so much time together, there was never a spark between them, and that they were good friends. Secondly, is that Indy has some mild skepticism on the notion that all these artifacts actually come from Atlantis. He definitely leans towards logical explanations more often than not. So, carrying on, he eventually turns out the lights and lies down on the couch. He turns in for the night. As he lies there, with the hat over his eyes, the door creaks open. He thinks it might be Sophia until he hears a man's voice, whispering that he has managed to get the door open. Then, stepping past his goons, Kerner enters the dark apartment, and basically tells his men, "Good, remember, take all the artifacts, and kills a woman. I cannot risk her knowledge." They're just trying to keep quiet for the time being. Kerner then looks to his side and sees Indy standing there, looking at him with his hand in his pocket, in a manner that would suggest that he has a gun. He does not. In bluff confidence, he says to him, "Oh, hello, Kerner, what role are you playing now?" Essentially, just trying to act tough. And Kerner calls his bluff, saying that he doubts he brought his gun in order to visit an old friend, which doesn't make all too much sense, but anyway, he calls his bluff. So at this point, Sophia is awoken from her sleep by the loud commotion coming from outside her door. She remarks, "Indy, what are you doing, eating the furniture?" And she is then brought up to speed on the seriousness of the situation by the gunshot coming from inside her apartment. She takes out a gun of her own and is then brought further up to speed when Indy and the two goons come crashing through her bedroom door onto the ground in a full-on brawl. Indy is, during this, shouting to her like, "Gee, Sophia, shoot somebody!" And she does. She fires her revolver and hits one of the men in the knee, causing him to flee back out the room. Indy shouts to her to get out of there as the remaining goon shoots him in the shoulder. He then kicks the man in response, sending him crashing out of the window, and firing his pistol wildly into the night, he falls to his death on the city street far below. And something I just want to highlight here quickly is I love the comment that Indy gives here about this. As the man falls from the window, he lets out this kind of long scream, goes "Aye!" as he falls, and Indy then comes over and looks out the window and he says, "What do you know, big man like that, a soprano," commenting on the sound he just made. So again, it's just these like brilliant comments that come out of his mouth. So this whole time that this fight's been going on, the second goon that ran has managed to bag all of the Atlantean artifacts and make off with them. He brings them to Kerner, saying, like, "I gathered them all like you said," and Kerner thanks him with a cold expression on his face, and then shoots him. When Sophia helps an injured Indy back onto the couch, Kerner is gone. Indy is upset that all of the artifacts have been taken, but then she tells him that her necklace came from the expedition too, and that she still has it, as she never takes it off. He's beginning to become a bit delirious at this point from the wound, so he's looking at the necklace with this blissful smile on his face, saying like, "That's my Sophie," the way it's drawn, it kind of looks like he's drunk, and her response is obviously, "You're really hurt, we need to get you to a hospital." So this whole scene at the apartment is a great introduction to Sophia's character. I really enjoy her as a character. The relationship that she has with Indy is fun, and I really enjoy the back and forth that happens between them. It's just a great character. We then jump forward to a week later in Nuremberg, Germany. Colonel Klaus Kerner, now in his SS officer uniform, sits with a scientist named Dr. Uberman, who has been studying all of the artifacts. The doctor explains that the artifacts hold clues to the most powerful energy source known to mankind. Kerner asks if this power source is as powerful as Hahn and Strassmann's atomic reaction. He is referring to Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann, who were credited with the discovery of nuclear fission in 1938, which is a year before this story takes place. The doctor claims that this energy source is more powerful than atomic energy, and on top of that, there is no clumsy lead shielding required and no radioactive byproducts. He speaks of ancient lore about an energized metal known as orichalcum from the continent of Atlantis. He opens one of the horned idols and shows Kerner the small purple orb inside. This is the orichalcum. He theorizes that all Atlantean technology was powered with this substance. He demonstrates this by activating the idol. The torso of the idol begins to rotate rapidly. It is a drill of some sort. Dr. Uberman then points the device at a wall in the lab which has a target painted on it, and lets it loose. With unbelievable speed and efficiency, the device bursts through the wall onto the outdoor grounds of the lab, and upon hitting the ground, continues its course by burrowing into the soil. The two men run outside and stand looking into the hole. The doctor explains that it will keep going until it reaches the molten core of the earth. And, it just doesn't make much sense to me. I know that they must have a large budget for whatever research they conduct at this lab, but he just lets the thing go. You don't know how many are left, and you just let the idol go, just disappearing and infinitely digging into the ground. I'm just imagining the courtyard is full of holes, because he seems to have done it before. How many has he let go? If you're new to the lab, you might think that German rabbits are on steroids or something. There's just these enormous holes all over the grounds of this building. It's just funny to imagine. So the scene closes out here with Uberman standing over the hole and saying how they now hold the fate of the world in their hands. And before we continue with the story, we're just going to hop over to the mid-break, and then we'll be right back into the story. So I'll see you there.
Snakes. Why did it have to be snakes?
Well, hello, and welcome to the mid-show break. This is a short segment in the middle of the episode where I'll cover some stuff about the show itself and explain a few things. Firstly, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Kel, or Sir Bandit, a lifelong fan of Indiana Jones, as you can imagine, and the host of the show. And thank you so much for tuning in. This podcast is available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube, as well as some other platforms such as Podchaser and Pandora. If you like what you're hearing, you can support the show by sharing it around. And another way you can support the show would be by leaving a 5-star rating on Spotify and leaving a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. Speaking of, the mid-show break is also where I'll be reading out reviews from Apple Podcasts. Currently, Spotify lets you give a star rating and nothing else, whereas Apple Podcasts allows you to actually write a review along with it. Leaving ratings and reviews helps tremendously with the show's growth, as it lets the different sites know that people are enjoying the show. And as I said, if you leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, I will be reading it out on the show, in this segment. Of course, there are none to read yet, as the show is brand new. If you have any questions or want to reach out, you can come hang out on the Robots Radio Discord server, where you will find a channel for the show. You can also contact me via email at indianajoneslawcast@gmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter at IndyLawcast. With all that said, I hope you're enjoying the episode, and let's hop right back into the action.
I'm going after that truck.
How?
I don't know. I'm making this up as I go.
At the hospital, Indy, in his hospital bed, is talking to Marcus. He maintains that the artifacts cannot be from a real lost city of Atlantis. While making his arguments, he cuts out crude outlines of the continents from paper and shows Marcus that they fit together seamlessly, with no room for a supposed lost continent to have drifted off and then sank. Marcus is convinced, but keeps somewhat of an open mind. Because, sure, the artifacts are valuable in an academic sense, as far as they know, but why would the Nazis have such an interest in them? Surely Adolf was not interested in academic laurels, as Marcus points out. Indy plans to visit other archaeologists who have been doing follow-up work on the Jastrow expedition. One is currently in Iceland, one in Mexico, and as well as some others. He has a batch of cables written and ready to send to each of them. Then, in comes Jerry. Indy is surprised to see him, angrily saying that he should still be in school, and Jerry explains that he has permission to leave, and that he came as soon as he could when he heard that he'd been shot. Indy says, he basically tells him, you gave up football practice to see me, I'm touched. He then gives Jerry the stack of letters to send, along with the money to post them, and he sends them off quite hastily. In this moment, Indy feels some bitterness about the fact that Sophia hasn't visited him once while he was in the hospital, and Marcus, who is on his way out the room, tells him that she had in fact spent a sleepless night there when they were digging the bullet out of him. He basically says to him maybe she's working on this thing too, and that's why she hasn't visited. And working on it she was. As the story takes us to a bustling city street, we see Sophia with her notebook. She has been tracking down everyone on her client list in order to find out if any of them had told Kerner about the Atlantean artifacts. She then sees the secretary of one of her clients leave a building, a lady with large round glasses. This lady had also been with the group in her apartment. The secretary hails a taxi, and Sophia overhears her tell the driver to head to Midtown General, and this is the hospital where Indy is recovering. She puts 2 and 2 together and then frantically hails a taxi of her own in order to follow her. Back at the hospital, Indy is still in bed, eyes closed, and the door opens quietly as a gun is trained on him. He opens his eyes and sees the shadow of the unwelcomed guest on the opposite wall of the room. As the gun fires, he leaps from the bed, the pillow exploding into a cloud of feathers. And this is just another brilliant moment here. As he peeks over the bed at the shooter, he sees that it's the secretary. He basically says, "Oh, hey, wrong room, I don't know you." Obviously assuming this is some quarrel that he has nothing to do with, and she has him mistaken for another guy. And he then recognizes her from the group at Sophia's apartment. And he says to her, "Oh, right, the seance, now I remember, so I shooed you out, but is that really cause for murder?" He's just being a smart mouth. And something I'd like to bring up here as well is the spelling of certain words here. When this woman speaks, all of her J's are replaced with CH's, so she says Dr. Chones. And in response to his witty remarks just then, she says to him, "Your last choke, I assure you." This is obviously indicative of the accent with which she speaks. She also exclaims in German when she is then hit over the back of the head with a handbag and knocked unconscious. Sophia had arrived, just in time. She searches the woman's bag and finds that this Beth Adams is actually Fräulein Jutta Schwarzkopf. Indy and Sophia then proceed to argue, literally nose to nose, Indy saying how whenever she shows up he gets shot at, and her asking him why he suddenly becomes so popular in Berlin. At this moment, she then claims to receive a vision from her necklace, a clear image of somewhere in Iceland, somewhere she apparently needs to go. She asks Indy if he's coming with her. Of course, Iceland is where Indy was planning to go in any case to visit the contact previously mentioned. He says that he is going with, but only because it's logical, not because of her crazy visions. We then jump to Long Island, New York, where Marcus Brody and Jerry are seeing Indy and Sophia off. The pair are climbing aboard a seaplane as they plan to make short hops across the Atlantic to get to Iceland. After saying their short goodbyes and giving a wave, they then take off. We are then given a panel of a map with a line showing the course they will take. This is another staple of the series. Were this a film, we would certainly be treated to one of the amazing map transitions where we get to see the line move from location to location. It's great. During the flight, Indy's ears begin to get cold, so Sophia tells him to take his stupid fedora off and use the pilot's cap, which he does. Their last stop before their destination is Greenland, where some locals row out on boats out to the plain in order to give them some supplies for their journey. But they then discover that the pontoons can't lift from the water suction with so much weight aboard the plane. The pontoons are the hollow containers under the seaplane that allow it to land on the water. So what they then have to do is throw some of the supplies out of the plane into the water. I know that they're in a huge hurry, but it's just really sad to see all those good supplies be thrown into the sea like that. It's unclear where they were when they had to do this, but I hope the locals didn't see it from their village. You know, I don't know if you've seen that image of that bald man, it's an Indian man I believe, who's standing on the side of a sports field and he looks like very disappointed, he has his hands on his hips. I'm just imagining a whole village of people doing that. As they are taking off, Sophie says that she has an idea. Indy could go out and wave his big fedora around to create some much needed wind and waves for the takeoff. She really seems to have a vendetta against this hat. And once they have successfully taken off, Indy turns back to her and says that the wind and waves must have been caused by her mouth flapping, and she calls him a clod. Again, the back and forth here is just great. They finally arrive in Iceland, where we see that Indy has found a compromise by wearing his iconic fedora as well as earmuffs. They reach the location of Indy's contact and find him in a geyser, frozen solid, and in his hand, another horned idol, one of the drill devices. Indy is then lowered into the geyser by rope, with Sophia handling it up top, and he uses a small pick to break the idol free. But as he completes this, the geyser begins to rumble and heat up. Panic then ensues, with Indy yelling at Sophie to pull harder and her yelling at him to climb harder. The geyser then bursts, sending a column of water shooting into the air and flinging Indy a short distance and flat onto his face, thankfully unboiled. They then continue on their journey. They stop briefly in the Azores to search for anything Jastrow himself might have stored away after the expedition, as this was his last stop after Iceland. After the expedition. Sophia, strangely, is able to flawlessly communicate with a local old man, even with a language barrier. She doesn't seem to know how she did this, but suspects the necklace is responsible. Their investigation leads them to a small coastal cave with a whole stash of Atlantean artifacts, more horned idols, more orichalcum pearls, as well as a strange small stone disc of some kind, which looks like it is part of a puzzle. Across the Atlantic, they go once again, this time to the Yucatan in Mexico. There they meet a man named Sternhardt, the owner of a local antique shop. He guides them to a ruined temple in the middle of the jungle. Sternhardt points out that the designs look Mayan, but much older. Making their way inside, they see the running spiral designs and the imagery of the horned figures. Definitely on the right track here. They find a tomb deeper into the temple, and upon opening it, they find that the skeleton within seems deformed, and has two small horns protruding from the skull. Buried with the skeleton was a small stone disc, which looks to be part of the one they found in the Azores. While they were studying the tomb, Sternhardt takes the disc and the horses discreetly, and leaves Indy and Sophia in the jungle, in the temple. The pair of them had just wisened up to this fact when the floor opens beneath them. It is a pitfall trap. The fall wasn't far, but it wouldn't have had to be far, as the victims of this trap would then have to deal with the crocodiles in the pit they found themselves in. Luckily for Indy and Sophia, the crocodiles are long dead, their skeletons lying here and there on the stone floor. Unknown to them, however, back in America, Marcus Brody receives a letter from a contact in Spain, who urges him to come and see him. A matter of life and death, he is told. When he visits the contact, he is told a story that he is at this point all too familiar with. This contact of his had artifacts from the Jastrow expedition, until a German man asked to come and study them, and upon arriving he tried to kill him. He narrowly escaped with his life, and only had one artifact left of this collection that wasn't stolen. This artifact is yet another stone disc. A third stone disc. We then jump back to Mexico as Indy and Sophia walk down the street without horses, as they've had to walk back to civilization on foot. They look quite disheveled. They're informed by someone at the consulate that there is a cable waiting for them, correspondence from Marcus, telling them to meet him in Leningrad, Russia. It's really hard not to feel exhausted for them at this point. Travel is a large part of the Indiana Jones stories, and this one is certainly no exception. Upon arriving in Leningrad, the two of them meet with Marcus on the front steps of a museum. Marcus introduces them to the local curator of manuscripts, a large bearded man named Vladimir Radichenko, who comes running down the stairs and greets Indy by giving him a huge bear hug, lifting him right off the ground as his back cracks. He is a fan of Indy's work. They've been called here, firstly to be given the stone disc by Marcus, but also to read a particular manuscript, the lost dialogue of Plato called the Hermocrates. This manuscript contains information about Atlantis, and there are only 2 copies on Earth. Vladimir is leading them down the hallway to the archive storeroom when they hear gunfire coming from inside. Upon entering, they see the workers dead at their desks and Kerner with his Nazi agents, guns still smoking. Kerner briefly holds a woman hostage before throwing her onto Indy and ordering his men to shoot them all. Indy is able to draw his revolver and shoot one of them as Vladimir tackles another to the ground and beats him with his bare hands. Sophia beats another over the head with a large book. We then see Indy make use of his iconic whip, as he uses it to whip one of the Nazi agents in the face before he can fire his weapon. Oof, imagine that. As the fight is coming to an end, Kerner, as seems to be a habit of his, escapes in a waiting car. The trio discuss a course of action. Vladimir is, of course, dismayed at what has happened and says that the only remaining copy of the Hermocrates manuscript is with the Dunlop collection, but he doesn't know where that collection is stored. But Indy does. After all this travelling and all the miles they've crossed, where is their grand prize? Right back home is where. The Dunlop collection, as Indy tells them, is stored at Barnet College. And that is going to be where we leave the story for this episode. In the next episode, we will be continuing our covering of the fate of Atlantis, following it to its dramatic conclusion. Thank you so much for listening, and if you have any questions, you can find me in my office. But until then, remember, saving your teacher from mortal peril is sure to get your grades up, but you will be seen as a teacher's pet. I'll see you all next time. Thanks for listening to the Indiana Jones Lorecast. If you like what you hear and want to support the show, Drop a rating or review wherever you're listening. I'll see you next time.